sind wir dran.
Nikolai Stein, are you on? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear and see me?
Okay, great. Let's see here. We can see you. Don't see you yet. Have you? Okay, there you go. Now we see you.
Okay, great.
So, why don't you go ahead and start your presentation?
Yeah, right. So I will take this time just to share the video because I saw the record of yesterday and it was quite, you know, I think that the video is more fluent, so that I will just share the video. I hope you can see then the screen and it works the way. Okay, so my topic today is the successful requirements exchange using ReqIF in the automotive industry using DOORS Next and our product, the ReqIF-Manager. So first a few words to our company. So the ReqIF GmbH is a tool vendor and a consulting company for DOORS and DOORS Next Generation. We have implemented a lot of tools specific for our customers, which then we sell also as a product. For DOORS 9, for document generation, ReqIF data exchange, data synchronization, working offline with DOORS, on D&G migration and DOORS 9 security add-ons. And we also implement tools for DOORS Next Generation, which is one of the products that we showed yesterday for the migration from DOORS 9 to DOORS Next Generation, and the ReqIF-Manager, which is enabling an automation and optimization for the ReqIF exchange process. We also have implemented a lot of tools around the ReqIF for ReqIF transformation, ReqIF analyzation, and so on. And we also provide services, managed services for DOORS and the IBM platform. Most of our customers are located in Europe. Of course, we have some other customers in overseas for our product, and most of our customers work in the area of the automotive domain. So my agenda today is I would like to give you a short introduction into ReqIF, into the requirements exchange using the HIS process in the automotive industry, which is the standard process of exchanging requirements between automotive OEMs and their suppliers, and what are the basic requirements that the OEM and suppliers have for the ReqIF interchange if they are following the HIS process. Then I would like to show you how D&G and the ReqIF-Manager together can meet these requirements. And I will give you some information about the benefits that you have if you use that kind of combination of both. And then we have the Q&A session afterwards. So the topic is also a complex thing. Time is limited, so if you have any more questions, simply just drop me an email and I will give you the answer afterwards. Or please use the Q&A session and ask all that you always wanted to ask. So what is ReqIF? ReqIF is a tool-independent format for exchanging requirements. So the idea is to have an ability to exchange requirements between different requirements tools. So for example, IBM or Polarion, so that, or from IBM also, IBM into, I'm sorry, it's not that easy, and IBM DOORS Next Generation and DOORS 9. The specification is publicly available at the Object Management Group, which also has a lot of other open standard specifications available. The format itself is the standard for exchanging requirements, and beside the normal specification and standardization process, there is also an implementer and workflow forum at ProStep to coordinate all the efforts and implementation details between the different tool vendors. So this is the forum where the tool vendors exchange each other and talk about issues during the ReqIF interchange process to make the standard as interoperable as possible. There's also an implementer guide that gives information that are non-normative, which are recommendations how to implement the tools for doing ReqIF interchange. The standard itself was derived from the RIF standard from Herstellerinitiative Software, which is also the name giver for the HIS process. So they also developed the process itself. And the first release was in October 2013. So in October, it's going to be 8 years old, the standard. So what are the main properties of ReqIF? Firstly, it's XML based. And it gives you the possibility to have a set of all the base types already in there. So you don't have to define the base types like string, text, integer, float. But you are able to extend the type system with your own types and attributes. So basically, as you can do in DOORS or DOORS Next Generation. The text formatting within the file format is using a subset of XHTML, and you may use objects, or in ReqIF you call them spec objects, multiple times within a document. And you also may have spec objects that exist outside the document structure. So this is basically quite what is possible in DOORS Next Generation. You have artifacts which are outside the module, and you can have artifact multiple times within the same document. You can have links with own attributes between the objects, and if you are exchanging data that comes with attachments like PDF, Word document, or whatever that is referenced from the requirements, then you can have a ReqIF Z package that contains the ReqIF file plus all the attachments bundled together in a package. There are also some naming conventions that have been invented by the implementer forum, which is, for example, to map all the requirements text to a reserved attribute name called reqif.text and all the headings to reqif.chapter name. There are also other reserved names for certain purposes, but this is just an example that shall make it easier for different tool vendors to have an interchange here without need to know how the attribute is named on the other side. So for example, if you're exporting data from DOORS 9, the attribute would be called object text, which is then mapped to reqif.text, and when it gets imported using DNG, then reqif.text will become the primary text afterwards. With a differentiation, if the value is in reqif.chapter name, then this primary text will be displayed as a chapter, and if the content is coming in reqif text, then it will be displayed as a regular requirements text. So what is the HIS process that is being used in the automotive industry? So this is the standard process that is used in the specification reconciliation process. So this means that there is an exchange of requirements between the OEM and all his suppliers to get an agreement on every single requirement. So the goal is that you have multiple round trips exchanging data from OEM to supplier, from supplier to OEM, and so on, to have it as a cycle until you found an agreement on every single requirement. In order to do this, we are using a pair of attributes, 2 attributes for the OEM, 2 attributes for the supplier, each a status attribute and a comment attribute. So you have some field where you can put in plain text and some other that is using status information, which follows a standardized process. There are the values that are valid for the status, and their next possible values, they are standardized in the HIS process here. So if you have multiple suppliers, which you normally have in the automotive industry, mostly for parts that are very important for the car, then you have at least two suppliers that will deliver the parts. But in the phase where you're still awaiting the quotes for the parts, then you even may have 6 or more suppliers at the same time. So you are then exchanging the same data with 6 suppliers and have all 4 attributes for each supplier. So again, 2 for the OEM, 2 for the supplier, but you have them for every pair of OEM and supplier. So how does it basically work? You have the modules on your side as an OEM that you would like to exchange with your supplier. and you have a pair of attributes that are used for the HIS process. So basically those two here. And you have attributes that carry your requirements. And also every side has its private attributes. So these are attributes that you don't want to share because they are private, they're containing private content that you don't want to share with the other side. For example, on the OEM side, it may be some internal comments, and on the supplier side, you often have also attributes carrying all information about the estimate, how big is the effort to fulfill this requirement. When you start the exchange process and export the data from the OEM to the supplier, then the supplier is only willing to take updates to a subset of attributes. So these are marked here with this kind of red fence. So you don't want that your own attributes are overwritten during the import, basically. When the data is then afterwards sent back, then the OEM only want to import a very, very small subset, which is basically just the two attributes for the supplier, where the supplier is supposed to put a status and his comment in. So this is a very, very limited use case for importing the data. And if you have multiple suppliers, then you have the same thing also for other suppliers, but with a different set of attributes. So for supplier A, we had these attributes K and L, and for supplier 2, we have a different set of attributes for performing the HIS exchange process and the reconciliation. So knowing this, what are the technical requirements for an OEM that the exchange tool needs to fulfill? So first, for the export. So you only want to export a subset of data. This may be a filtered view if you, for example, have specified in your specification multiple variants in one document, but the supplier is only supposed to deliver one of the variants. Then, for example, you may have a filtered view that you export that does not contain all the artifacts. And the view contains only a subset of attributes, only containing the attributes that are supposed to be received by the supplier. So even the export of the attribute definitions could lead into an issue because the suppliers shall not know about each other and shall not know who are the other suppliers that are part of the bidding process. You often have big packages to export that contains data from multiple components. In the automotive industry, it's quite often that you have information that is delivered with multiple parts. So these information may lay in a different component, for example, than your normal component specification for the part itself. So there also need to be support for cross-component configuration, and if you have a big number of requirements to export, then you also have the need of parallel processing of the data to reduce the exporting time. As the HIS process has its status attributes, for example, a supplier can answer with agreed to a requirement. That means that he will accept the requirement, and the OEM then can react, yes, that's fine, I agree to your agreement, and then he will set his status also. So this is a quite easy step. If the supplier accepts a requirement without any comment, then of course the OEM will accept that. And for these manual steps, an automation is needed or wanted so that the OEM is not required to put his agreement on all the objects which are accepted by the supplier without any comment. When importing the data back from the supplier, the OEM only wants the attribute values of the attributes that the supplier is supposed to edit. So all the other changes shall be forbidden. So no changes to the type system, no requirements shall be changed, no structural changes, no changes to the values of other suppliers, and so on and so on. So it needs to be ensured that only the attribute values of those two attributes that the supplier is supposed to be added shall be updated during the import and nothing more. And also on automation, it is required that the automatic status can be set. When thinking of a supplier that is importing the data into his D&G system, then you also have some requirements. So normally it starts basically with an empty module. So during the import, you may want to import the type system, so you have attributes where the values can be put in. They come from the OEM, the attributes, they are part of the ReqIF file, and you may want to create the type system during import. You want to import all the requirements, and you want to import the module structure, and on new deliveries, you want that the structure is being updated so that the structure is the same as in the ReqIF package. But you also want to prevent the override of own attributes. So you don't want to have that your own custom attributes are overridden or even removed from an artifact type. And you want to prevent changes to your own his supplier attributes, because you may have worked there, you've put in some comments, and now you're getting a delivery from your OEM for an update, and then you don't want that all your content is being removed where you put in all your work. More than importing the type system, most suppliers want to still have their own artifact types, attributes, and enumeration values and link types, because, for example, they're using reporting that is requiring a certain set of attributes. So it would be better if the data that is coming from the ReqIF package is mapped into your own type system during the import, and then the content is being put into your existing type model by mapping, for example, the attributes to existing attributes, and of course also the enumeration values to your own enumeration values. For example, if you have a customer which is a German OEM, then the values in the enumeration values may be German, and you want to map then, for example, to your own English values, which you can then directly map during the import, which will make it more easy for your engineers to work with the data and put in their result status attributes. For the export, you also have the requirement that you only export a relevant subset of data. So in the normal HIS process, it's quite sufficient to only export those two supplier attributes that you have. So you don't need to export the requirements text. That will reduce the export package, of course, a lot. But what's more important, you don't want to export your private attributes to the OEM. So it's also a requirement that there is only a subset being exported. You also have the need of exporting big packages, maybe also from multiple components. And if there was a mapping involved during the import, then you want that the mapping is reversely applied afterwards. So what's covered out of the box by D&G? For the OEM, exporting a subset, you can use a view, so view-based export is possible. Not everyone knows how to configure it, so it's quite tricky to configure it in a good way, but exporting a subset is supported and works nearly perfectly, but just some tricky things. Import only certain attribute values is also supported if using the advanced ReqIF import, but there are some changes that cannot be prevented because there isn't a setting of preventing it, and as there isn't a setting to prevent it, it's implied that this change is being allowed, and that can then change your data even if you don't want to. One example that I remember is that we had the case that the supplier has renamed the modules on his side, and when the data was imported into DOORS Next Generation, then the name of the modules were changed on the OEM side. And if the ReqIF package contained additional artifact types, then these have been also created even if they were not used or changed. There is no support currently for any automation, so no automatic creation of change set, no kind of post-processing script that will run over all the artifacts to update the content afterwards. So this is currently not supported. Big export packages from multiple components is also not supported, so you have to create a ReqIF definition on every component manually. And if you are exchanging with multiple partners, then you would have to create an individual ReqIF definition for each partner, which will cause a lot of work. If you remember, you have about 40 to 80 modules to configure, and you need to set this up for 80 partners, then there's a lot of things to do, especially if you have to configure the view individual for each partner. If you think of a supplier, then you have the need to import the type system, requirements, and structure, which is basically supported. But the mapping of types and attributes is only working on an RDF URI basis. So that would mean that you upfront would agree between the OEM and the supplier to use the same RDF URIs for the same attributes and so on. But this is something that I think will never happen, because the OEM has his RDF URIs and the supplier has his RDF URIs. So this implicit mapping that would then happen automatically is also currently not supported. The export of relevant subsets, so again view-based, is of course supported. Beside these process requirements, what are other ReqIF challenges that you have to deal with? Different tools have different capabilities. So for example, in some tools you have text formatting in additional attributes. In DNG you don't have text formatting in additional attributes. You have a concept of reusing artifacts. Some tools have, some other tools don't. If you're mapping the ReqIF file to your tool system, then you need to choose how to deal with reusing objects and artifacts and so on. There are differences in external files. For example, you have OLE objects in DOORS 9, but you have plain files like PDFs and Word document in wrapped resources in DOORS Next Generation. You have different or wrongly interpretation of the ReqIF standard. So this is nothing that's just specific to DNG. This is quite common thing that there are misinterpretations or different interpretation of the ReqIF standard. For example, the ReqIF standard or the implementer guide says that a tool should use relation groups if they have links that go across the boundary of the document. So this is something that should be used, but in the standard itself, it's not mandatory, it's optional. Then ReqIF only allows a subset of XHTML, but some tools export more than it is basically allowed. Some tools will check this up front and then deny the file. Other tools will try to import the content and will then lead into an error afterwards. XHTML is also quite strict. What is the nesting of different XHTML elements? So also, even if the tags are allowed, it may be that their nesting is wrong. So this could also lead to a problem during the ReqIF interchange. And there are also different interpretation of XML itself. Sometimes line breaks are interpreted. Sometimes they are interpreted as a line break, sometimes just as a white space, sometimes not. Sometimes there's an issue with tabs inside, so if someone has pretty printed the XML file, for example, and so on and so on. So these are all common ReqIF challenges that may come if you are doing ReqIF interchange. So what are the basic difference between DOORS Next and other tools? Well, this is just an excerpt, so just a few to mention. DNG has multiple artifact types. These are called spec object types in ReqIF. This is fine. This is directly one-to-one from DNG to ReqIF. But some tools do not have a support for multiple spec object types. And so it may happen that you export a file with 10 artifact types. The data gets exported at the supplier into a tool that does not have the concept of spec object types. And when the data is coming back, you only receive a file with just one artifact type. And then you have a mismatch because this object that you would like to import has an artifact type, maybe requirement, in the ReqIF package, but in your tool it's information or heading or whatever. So this, and also in ReqIF, the attributes exist within the scope of a spec object type, which means that the same attribute with the same name may exist for multiple spec object types, but with a different identifier. And so if you have an object and a reference from the object to the attribute, and the spec object type is a different one that was already that was exported before, then you have a mismatch in the attribute ID, and this may lead into a problem during the import. DNG has a concept of embedded artifacts. So I'm not talking about having a file within the embedded within the text. I'm talking about real embedded artifacts, so that kind of placeholders or parameters or however you name them, so you can kind of quote an artifact within the artifact. This is something that do not have any representation in ReqIF. So DNG needed to find a trade-off between a DNG to DNG export where they could find a way to deal with it, and an exchange protest from DNG to the rest of the world. DNG has a different approach of reusing an artifact than ReqIF itself does. So in ReqIF it's basically possible to have a spec object that is being referenced multiple times within a specification hierarchy. DNG follows a different approach. On every artifact reuse, DNG creates a different spec object within the ReqIF file. So basically from the ReqIF package, the reused object is getting duplicated within the ReqIF package, which is quite okay, because in that case, if the other tools on the other side does not allow artifact reuse, then the data can be easily imported. That's fine so far. But when the data comes back from the supplier and this artifact has been duplicated in the ReqIF file and was commented by the supplier, it may be the case that he comments each occurrence of the same requirement in a different way, which is quite normal because you always have context of these requirements. So maybe this requirements in one context makes sense, but in the other context it does not make any sense. But during import, all those occurrences of this object are mapped back to one single artifact, and then the data is imported multiple times, first for the first occurrence, then for the second occurrence, and then for the third occurrence, and so on. So in the end, in this artifact, you only have the last value, so the last comment of this requirement here. DNG uses global configuration, can have different streams. So you always need to be sure that you're using the right stream to export and import data. So this is nothing that is a really difference between ReqIF or DNG. This is just something that you know and you have to know in your process, that you're always using the right stream when exchanging data. Because if you're exporting the data from one stream and importing the data back into some other stream, you may end up with a great mess. So this is where the ReqIF-Manager came into place. We have implemented it for a German car manufacturer who asked us to implement it. Currently we sell it as a product, but it started by an order of an OEM to create this tool. So it was created to ease the exchange process for an OEM. especially to configure the data as a reusable round-trip configuration with settings for export and imports with multiple suppliers, multiple components, which allows you to pre-select things for a partner like the view name, like the correct stream and so on. And also later, it was not part of the first release, allow a supplier to map the data during the import. It allows us the configuration works cross-component, already mentioned, and also automates the whole exchange process. So you will have one interface where you put in all the configuration and the ReqIF Manager will do the work for you. So it will create the ReqIF definitions, it will start the export, it will collect the results and then put everything together in a zip package so that once the whole process is completed, then the user can pick up the whole file. And it also allows an automation of his process, so a pre-processing before the export and a post-processing after the import that can be executed pre or post the ex or import. We are also optimizing the compatibility. So I mentioned some ReqIF challenges that you have to deal with. So we optimize the files before the import and after the export to make them as compatible as possible. We also do schema checking of the export results to be sure that this file is completely schema conform, and also when uploading data that comes from your customer or supplier, it's also checked directly for any schema issues, so you know upfront before the data hits D&G. And it gives you also information about when there are type differences that make an issue during the import. The automation, I think I already mentioned the most, so creating the ReqIF definitions, collect the ReqIF files. And that's something that I forgot before, we automatically create change sets before performing the import. So in the import you configure a stream, but before the import is really executed, we create a change set, import the data to that change set, and leave it up to the user to check the data within the change set before it gets delivered afterwards. How does it basically look like within the tool? We start by creating a thing that we call ReqIF set. This is something like a project. Then you give it a name, you select your role, if you are a customer, so OEM is customer, or if you are a supplier. So if you are a customer, then the export will be view-based. You have the ability to use multiple export partners where you can export data to. And for the import, we allow an alternative import path that is not using the ReqIF interface of D&G, but it will then use OSLC to import the data without having the issues of mismatching ReqIF IDs. In this case, we will just read the ReqIF file, map them by the name and put them into the requirement regardless if the artifact type is still correct and so on. So that will make it more robust if the data gets somehow corrupted by the supplier. If you're a supplier, then you have the possibility to perform a mapping which will be in the export reversely applied. So you start, then you add partners to a ReqIF set, so all your suppliers. Then you simply add modules from D&G by simply using drag and drop. So just drop the ReqIF modules, the D&G modules directly here. They get automatically grouped to components. So you then in the end can choose on a component level what is the right exchange stream to perform the export and to perform the import. We can then select a view individually for each partner, and we can before configure a default view for each partner. So if you add modules, then the modules will be added to all the partners with the right view that has been pre-configured. And we also allow the selection of attributes that are allowed to be imported later. To execute the export, we simply use the same UI, select all the modules that we would like to export, then push on export. We do this for all the partners, and then the export will be queued and automatically handled in the background. The queuing will ensure that only one export or import job is running on each DNG component, because there are some log issues if you're trying to export or import data of the same DNG component at the same time. So if you have an export job that contains 5 components, then it would be possible to basically run 5 export jobs in parallel, each starting with a different component and then waiting until another component is ready to, for the export or the import of data. In the end, we will create a zip package that contains all the ReqIF files and an XHTML documentation, which is a list of all the modules that are part of the export, the attributes and the type definition and the number of objects, so the other side can check after an import if the import was complete. During import, the whole configuration is always used for export and import within the same ReqIF set. So basically, if you have started with an export, then you already started the import with a list of all the modules. And if you're then getting the data from your suppliers, you just simply drag and drop all the files in the upload area here. And then these files will be automatically attached to the right DOORS, to the right DNG module and the right component, so that when you then push to start the import job, then the files will be uploaded to the right component, the correct ReqIF definition will be created, and the data will be imported to the right place. And before, of course, a change set will be created to perform the import. If you are in the customer role, then you have also this already mentioned OSLC-based alternative import path. When doing the import as a supplier, you have the ability to use a mapping that allows you to map every artifact type that is in the ReqIF file to your own artifact type, and for each artifact type map all the attributes that are in the ReqIF file to attributes that you have in DNG. There's also support of merging attributes. So if your customer is delivering you multiple attributes that you all want to merge into custom attribute, then this content can be merged into the string attribute and can be split also after the data is being exported afterwards. You also do the mapping for link types, and you simply do this by using drag and drop. So the type system is getting read from DNG, the type system is getting read from ReqIF, and you simply map them together using the mapping UI. Then the execution of the import is basically the same as from the export. You select the modules that you would like to import, push import, and then the job is running in the background. And once it is finished, you see then the result in the jobs view, where also all DNG logs are collected and checked for any issues within the log file. So you get exclamation marks here for the modules where you have any issues doing the import in the ReqIF file or from some other process step. So afterwards you have all the data together. You can download a log file package that contains all the information about all the jobs, all the modules within the job, and save it to disk or check them for further purposes. So what are the benefits of that? For an OEM, the biggest benefit is that you are able to do the configuration across components and for multiple suppliers at the same time. So this saves much time, because you're simply using drag and drop, putting all the modules in, then you have them for all suppliers, you have pre-selected the view name, and so simply it just takes a few minutes to configure the export for all suppliers at the same time. The jobs can be processed in parallel in the background, which saves a lot of execution time. for the export, and for all those data that's getting somehow corrupted during the round-trip process, so where the artifact types have been lost or identifiers of attributes have been lost, then we also have this OSLC-based import that will allow you to import the data even if it would not be possible to import the data in DNG itself. And we have this automated HIS process that allows the automatic execution of a customizable script that can be executed here that will run over all the objects, compare the status of the objects with an earlier baseline or the underlying stream, and then from that difference decide to what attribute values shall be updated for that. For the suppliers, the key benefit is that we allow the type mapping so that they can keep their own type system, import the data that comes from the OEM into his own type system, and when the data is being exported back, then we will use the originally received type system and then put the data into that ReqIF file containing the original type system, so that on the other side the files can be imported directly without any differences in the type system. Checking the ReqIF files before doing the import can also help you to check for problems, because the check will then also say you in that line you have an issue with the ReqIF file, so you can directly send the data back to the one where you've received the data and say, okay, this data is not correct, see here, there is an issue. And if we wouldn't do such checks, then you may end up with just some error which is not giving you any more hint what's basically the problem. Summary, ReqIF is the standard for doing requirements industry in the automotive industry. The HIS process is the standard that needs to be used here, at least in Germany, and I think a lot of other countries have also adopted this process in a similar way. There are different tool capabilities and interpretations of the ReqIF standard, and these create a lot of challenge. But when you use the ReqIF-Manager, then you can go around all these topics because of the file optimization upfront and afterwards. And so the ReqIF-Manager together with DNG will allow all the OEMs and supplier to have a smooth export process and a robust toolchain. So that's basically it. So I'm up for questions right now. After the session and after the conference itself, we will open again our virtual booth. So if you have any things to discuss, we will be there and also answer questions or discuss about different topics.
Okay. Thank you, Nikolai. Attendees, you can start submitting your questions. I see one currently. Andre, you want to go ahead and start that process and ask the question?
Yeah, sure. So the first question is ReqIF-Manager DNG specific?
Yes. Simple question, yes. It is using the APIs of DNG, so the ReqIF API and OSLC. It is running independently, so it comes as a Docker container, which will then communicate with DNG using the APIs, but it is specific for DNG.
When using ReqIF between different DNG installations, are you able to use the internal foreign ID attribute to keep up with ID numbers between DNG instances?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correct. So yes, we can use also the ReqIF-Manager to exchange data from DNG to DNG, and we will keep the existing extensions in the ReqIF package as far as possible. So basically what will work is, for example, exchanging diagrams and so on. So all those things that are additional in the tool extension should also work in a G&G to D&G transfer. We have an extra checkbox in the configuration of the partners to say if the other partner is using D&G or not, because in that case we will deactivate some optimization steps that is meant to enhance the compatibility. And when you're exchanging from D&G to D&G, these steps are then skipped.
Okay, Willie, if that answers your question, or if you have something else, please feel free to follow up. But in the meantime, we don't have any more questions in the queue, so I can pass it back to Mark. Sorry, one just popped in. We'll take it back a step. One issue we have seen using ReqIF to import the DNG to the module name became the artifact type after import. Is this intended, or did we import it correctly? We would like to map requirements to base types, such as customer requirements.
Okay, there are a lot of more questions. I think I'll start with the first one. Yeah, if a rename during the import is something that is intended, that's a good question. From an OEM perspective, I would say it's not intended, but there may, of course, be different use cases where I would say, yes, it is intended, but I think it's something that is a thing that should be kind of configurable if you want that, because it can get quite confusing if something gets renamed and you never know before that it was happen. So I think this was the first question, but there were more inside. Can you repeat them?
Sure. So I'll start from the middle. Is this intended, or did we import incorrectly? We would like to map requirements to base types, such as customer requirements.
Yeah, so we are mapping artifact types. So spec object types that come from the ReqIF file, map them to your own requirement, own artifact types. So for example, if the customer is sending you an artifact type called requirement, you can map this to customer requirement, for example. And if there's only one spec object type, then you can use an enumeration value to distinguish what artifact type to use during the import. So basically, if you think of an export that comes from DOORS 9, you often have such an attribute called object type or whatever, and then you can use this enumeration value and say if there is the value heading inside, then use artifact type heading. If there is the value inside requirement, then use artifact type customer requirements. If there is information, then map it to customer information or just information or whatever.
A follow-up to that was there didn't appear to be an option to map the ReqIF artifacts to existing types.
Pardon me?
The follow-up was that there didn't appear to be an option to map the ReqIF artifacts to existing types.
In ReqIF, in the ReqIF Manager, we have this ability, so you're able to map the types to from ReqIF to DNG and vice versa during the export. But it's not a functionality of DOORS 9, DOORS Next Generation itself.
Okay, so the next question. I have seen problems with ReqIF changing attribute values on import. Have you ever seen this? And then a follow-up to that is this question was related to import or to export from DOORS Next Generation and import to the same DOORS Next Generation installation.
I'm sorry, I have issues understanding.
I know that was a lot, so I could repeat it for you if necessary.
Holger, kannst du es lesen? Die Frage?
So I'll go ahead and repeat them. I've seen problems with ReqIF changing attribute values on import. Have you ever seen this? And this is related to export from DOORS Next Generation and import to the same DOORS Next Gen installation.
So you mean there's someone having issues when importing the values or the type system?
Yeah, they're asking if you've ever seen that, changing attribute values on import. Have you ever seen any problems?
Yeah, we had some issues during the import in the past when doing this without any mapping, so that sometimes the identifier have been changed for some reasons. And then the data could not be imported when the identifier of an artifact type was changed for some reason. So this is something that I can remember that was one of the problems of our customers before using any mapping. So basically from base DNG to base DNG without any tooling, that they had changing artifact type identifiers, for example.
Okay. How do you guarantee that this tool will synchronize 100% accurately the data between different requirements tools?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do some changes to the ReqIF file, and this ReqIF file is then imported normally with the DNG base functionality of DNG. So it's quite difficult for us to ensure the whole process because we do not have control over the whole process. So when we use the OSLC-based import, we do first an import and a compare, but we currently do not do this when using the normal ReqIF import.
Thank you, and that appears to be it for questions. I'll pass it back to her.
Thank you, Andre. Nikolai, thank you so much for presenting for us again today.
You're welcome.
Fabulous job. Everybody's been commenting how you do your presentation while you can stand there in front of your presentation and articulate yourself and show yourself while you're actually speaking. So that's an interesting feature that you've implemented. I'll have to reach back out to you to see how you've done that.
Sure.
So with that said, we're going to move on to the next presentation here. Nikolai, if you don't mind, go ahead and disconnect your
thank you.
Screen sharing.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Okay, so we're going to talk